The apartment was never quiet. That was the problem. Every night, the same pounding bass from upstairs. The same shouting matches through paper-thin walls. The same sirens wailing past on the street below. David had gotten used to it, the way you get used to anything when you don't have a choice. He was 19, working 2 part-time jobs while studying engineering at community college. Living in the cheapest place he could find that wasn't completely falling apart. It was a Tuesday evening in October when everything changed. David had just finished a double shift at the campus bookstore and dragged himself home. His backpack heavy with textbooks he couldn't afford to buy, but had to study somehow. He'd worked out a system with the manager, staying late to stock shelves in exchange for borrowing books overnight. It wasn't exactly legal, but nobody seemed to care. His roommate had moved out 3 weeks earlier, leaving without much explanation and owing 2 months of rent. David had been scrambling to cover the full amount ever since, picking up extra hours wherever he could find them. The apartment felt bigger and lonelier without someone else there, but at least it was quieter. That night, though, David noticed something his roommate had left behind. On the small desk near the window sat a pair of headphones. Not the cheap earbuds David used, but real over-ear headphones. It's a kind with padding that looked like it might actually block out the world. Next to them was a small sticky note with messy handwriting that just said, "Try track 7. You'll get it." David had no idea what that meant. His roommate had been a music student, always humming strange melodies and tapping out rhythms on every surface, but they'd never really talked about music. David's world was spreadsheets and equations, concrete problems with concrete solutions. Music was just background noise, something to fill the silence while he worked. But the headphones were expensive, and David was curious. He sat down, connected them to his laptop, and found the only music file his roommate had left behind, a playlist titled simply, "Start Here." Scrolled down to track 7. The title meant nothing to him. Symphony No. 9 in D minor, Opus 125. The composer was Beethoven. A name David recognized from movies and cartoons, but nothing more. He pressed play, expecting maybe something boring, something old people listen to in museums. The first notes were quiet, almost uncertain. Strings playing low and mysterious, like something was about to happen but hadn't quite arrived yet. David almost stopped it right there, but something made him wait. Then more instruments joined in, building, growing, the sound becoming bigger and more urgent. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, looking out over a landscape you'd never seen before but somehow recognized. He closed his eyes without meaning to. The music swelled and dropped, raced forward and pulled back, told a story without a single word. David had never paid attention to music like this before. Usually songs were just beats and hooks, something catchy you could tap your foot to. This was different. This demanded something from him, asked him to actually listen, to follow where it was going. Then, about 15 minutes in, everything changed. The music had gone through so many twists and turns, so many moments of darkness and light, that David had lost track of time completely. Suddenly, a single voice began singing, then more voices, then a whole choir exploding into sound. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but the way it built and built, adding more voices, more instruments, more power, made something crack open inside David's chest. He didn't understand the German words being sung, but he didn't need to. The music itself was speaking directly to something deeper than language. It was saying that despite everything, despite all the darkness and struggle and pain, there was joy. Not happiness, which felt temporary and fragile, but joy. Something bigger and more permanent. Something that existed underneath everything else. David sat completely still as tears ran down his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Not when his father left. Not when he'd had to drop out of the university he'd worked so hard to get into because he couldn't afford it. It's not even when he'd realized how alone he really was in this city. But now, listening to music written by a man who'd been dead for almost 200 years, he was crying like a child. When the music finally ended, 45 minutes after it started, David sat in silence. The bass was still thumping upstairs, the sirens still wailing outside. But somehow it all seemed farther away now, less important. He looked at his reflection in the dark laptop screen and barely recognized himself. His eyes were red, his face was wet, but there was something else there too. A kind of openness he hadn't felt in years. Like a fist that had been clenched tight had finally relaxed. He played it again immediately. And then again. By the third listen, he started noticing things he'd missed before. The way certain instruments answered each other, having conversations without words. The way the whole thing was structured like a journey, taking you from darkness into light. The way even the quiet moments mattered. Creating space for the loud ones to hit harder, David pulled up his phone and searched for information about the piece. He learned it was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, specifically the final movement, with the famous ode to joy melody. He learned that Beethoven had been completely deaf when he wrote it, unable to hear any of the sounds he was putting on paper. At the premiere, Beethoven had stood on stage trying to conduct, but he was so deaf he didn't know when the music ended. Someone had to physically turn him around so he could see the audience giving him a standing ovation. That fact hit David harder than anything else. Here was a man who couldn't hear, writing music that could make someone cry 2 centuries later. A man who had every reason to give up, to be bitter, to stop creating, but instead wrote something that celebrated the possibility of human connection and joy. David stayed up until 3 in the morning, reading everything he could find about Beethoven, about symphonies, about classical music. He learned that composers were real people with real struggles, not just names in textbooks. Mozart died poor and was buried in an unmarked grave. Tchaikovsky battled depression his entire life. Chopin wrote his most beautiful pieces while dying of tuberculosis. Coughing up blood between compositions, these weren't safe, comfortable people creating safe, comfortable music. They were humans pouring their entire souls onto paper, finding ways to make their joy and suffering and hope into something that could outlive them. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. David was feeling what Beethoven had felt, connecting across time and death and distance through nothing but organized sound as the sun started coming up. David made a decision. He didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but he knew something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent 19 years thinking of himself as someone practical, someone who dealt with facts and figures and real-world problems. Music was for other people, sensitive people, artistic people, not for someone like him. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe that door had always been there, and he just never tried to open it. Maybe everyone had this capacity inside them, waiting for the right moment, the right piece of music, the right situation to crack them open and let something new in. David saved his engineering homework for later and opened a new search tab. He typed in best classical music for beginners and started reading. The apartment was still noisy, the bills were still unpaid, his future was still uncertain. But now there was something else too, something he couldn't quite name yet but could feel growing. A sense that the world was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than he'd ever imagined, and that maybe, just maybe, there was room in it for someone like him to discover what had been hidden in plain sight all along. He clicked on the next recommendation, a piece by someone named Batch, and pressed play. The music started, and David leaned back, closed his eyes, and let himself fall into it. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He would never hear the world the same way again. David became a different person in the weeks that followed. Or maybe he became more himself. It was hard to tell. What was clear was that classical music had opened something inside him that refused to close back up. He started carrying his roommate's headphones everywhere. The world divided into 2 categories now: time when he could listen, and time when he had to wait until he could listen again. His coworkers at the bookstore noticed the change first. David had always been quiet, efficient, showing up on time and doing his work without complaint. Now, he had this distant look sometimes, like he was hearing something nobody else could. During his lunch breaks, instead of scrolling through his phone like everyone else, he'd sit in the back room with his eyes closed, completely absorbed in something they couldn't see. The playlist his roommate left behind had maybe 30 pieces on it, and David listened to each one dozens of times. But it wasn't enough. He needed more. The campus library became his second home. The music section was tucked away in a corner on the 3rd floor. dusty and forgotten by most students. Nobody came here anymore when everything was supposedly available online. But David discovered that the library had hundreds of classical music CDs that hadn't been checked out in years. He started methodically, working through composers alphabetically. Bach came first, and David felt like he was learning a new language. The music was mathematical, precise, each note fitting perfectly with every other note, like an equation that balanced itself. He'd listened to the cello suites while studying, and somehow the orderly beauty of Bach helped organize the chaos in his mind. The calculus problems that usually took hours seemed to solve themselves, as if the music was showing him patterns he'd been missing. Then came Mozart, and that was different entirely. Where Bach was architecture, Mozart was conversation. Playful, witty, full of surprises. David listened to Piano Concerto No. 21 while walking across campus one afternoon. Actually laughed out loud at a particular musical phrase the way you'd laugh at a clever joke. People stared at him, this serious guy, suddenly grinning at nothing, but David didn't care. He'd just gotten the joke that Mozart had written 250 years ago. Chopin nearly broke him. David had been feeling pretty good, enjoying his exploration, thinking he was getting the hang of this classical music thing. Then he listened to the nocturnes late one night, alone in his apartment. It felt like someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed. The music was so beautiful it hurt, so full of longing and sadness and impossible tenderness that David had to stop and catch his breath. How did Chopin know? How did a Polish composer who died in 1849 know exactly what it felt like to be lonely in a way you couldn't explain to anyone? David started reading about the composers' lives, hungry to understand who these people really were. He learned that Mozart had a crude sense of humor and loved making poop jokes in his letters. That Beethoven was a slob who threw food at waiters and never learned to multiply or divide. That Chopin was shy and sickly, giving concerts for small groups in candlelit salons because big concert halls terrified him. That Vivaldi was a red-haired priest who wrote concertos between church services. These details mattered too. David, it meant that genius didn't require perfection. These men, and the few women whose work had survived despite everything working against them, were messy and complicated and human. They got angry, fell in love, struggled with money, battled illness, felt jealous of their rivals, and somehow, out of all that ordinary human mésanges, they'd created something extraordinary. The librarian. An older woman named Ruth, who wore hand-knit cardigans and kept a thermos of tea at her desk, noticed David's frequent visits. One afternoon, as he was checking out his usual stack of CDs, she stopped him. "You know we have concerts here sometimes," she said. "Free ones. Small ensembles from the music department. Next one's Thursday evening, if you're interested." David showed up Thursday evening not knowing what to expect. The performance was in a small recital hall he'd never noticed before, tucked behind the main library building. Maybe 40 people were scattered across the seats, most of them elderly. A few music students he recognized from campus. David felt out of place immediately, too young, too poor, to obviously not someone who belonged in spaces like this. But when the string quartet started playing, all of that disappeared. It was one thing to hear music through headphones, another thing entirely to see it created live in front of you. He watched the violinist's fingers fly across the strings, the cellist's whole body swaying with the music, the way the four musicians communicated with tiny nods and glances, breathing together. Moving together like one organism with four parts, they played Beethoven's String Quartet No. 14, and David recognized it from his listening. But hearing it live was different. He could hear the scratch of horsehair on strings, the breath of the players, the slight squeak when someone changed positions. All the tiny human imperfections that made the perfection more real, more possible, more moving. After the concert, David lingered, watching the musicians pack up their instruments. He wanted to say something, to tell them what their playing had meant to him, but the words felt too big and clumsy. Finally, he approached the cellist, a grad student with tired eyes and calloused fingers. "That was beautiful," David managed. "Thank you." The cellist smiled, surprised and pleased. "You play?" "No. I'm just learning to listen. It's the harder part," the cellist said. "Most people never really learn to listen." They talked for 20 minutes. David asking questions that probably seemed basic and obvious, the cellist answering them with patience and enthusiasm. He learned that professional musicians practiced 4 to 6 hours every day, that a good cello cost more than a car, that most of them would never be famous or rich, but played anyway because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. It's like being fluent in a language nobody else speaks, the cellist explained. You spend your whole life learning this incredibly specific skill, and most people think it's irrelevant now. But when you connect with someone through the music, when you see it hit them the way it's hitting you, that makes everything worth it. David started attending every concert the university offered: chamber music, orchestral performances, student recitals, faculty showcases. He became a familiar face, the quiet guy in the back, who never missed a performance. The music students started nodding at him in recognition. Ruth the librarian began setting aside CDs she thought he'd like, creating a personal curriculum just for him, through the library's computer. David discovered online forums and communities dedicated to classical music. He'd assumed it was a dying art form, something only old people cared about. But here were thousands of people of all ages passionately discussing recordings, debating interpretations, sharing discoveries. He lurked for weeks before finally posting a question about a Mahler symphony he couldn't quite understand. The responses flooded in. People recommended recordings, explained historical context, shared their own experiences with the piece. One person, an older woman from somewhere in Europe based on her profile, sent him a particularly detailed message. She'd been a professional violinist for 40 years, played in orchestras across the world, and now spent her retirement helping newcomers discover the music she loved. Her name was difficult to pronounce. Something Eastern European, so she told him to just call her V. Over the following weeks, she became his informal teacher, sending him recommendations that went beyond the famous pieces everyone knew. She introduced him to Mahler's massive symphonies, these sprawling, hour-long journeys that contained entire universes. She explained how Shostakovich had hidden coded messages in his music, small rebellions against the Soviet regime that could have gotten him killed. She told him about Arvo Pärt, an Estonian composer who wrote music so sparse and pure it felt like hearing silence itself. The famous pieces are famous for a reason, V wrote to him. But they're just the beginning. There's so much more. Enough music for 100 lifetimes of listening? David downloaded everything she suggested. He listened to Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 and felt his heart physically ache. He discovered Debussy and felt like he was hearing colors instead of sounds. He found Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring and understood why it had caused a riot at its premiere. The rhythms so wild and primal, they seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to something older and deeper. His friends from his old life started to drift away. They'd invite him out, and he'd make excuses. How could he explain that he'd rather sit alone in his apartment listening to a Brahms symphony than go to a loud bar where he couldn't hear himself think? They thought he was becoming weird, pretentious, putting on airs. Maybe they were right. Or maybe he was just finally finding where he belonged. His grades improved without him trying. The same focus he brought to listening translated to studying. His engineering professors commented on his increased creativity and problem-solving, his ability to see patterns others missed. David didn't tell them it was because Bach had taught him about structure, right? That Mozart had shown him the beauty of elegant solutions. But the biggest change was internal, harder to quantify. David had spent his whole life feeling like he was just getting by, just surviving, pushing through each day toward some vague future that might be better. Now he had something that existed outside of survival. When everything else was hard, when the bills piled up and the loneliness pressed in, and the future looked uncertain, he had these pieces of music that transported him somewhere else, somewhere bigger and more beautiful than his circumstances. He was listening to Vivaldi's Four Seasons one afternoon in autumn, walking through campus as the leaves turned gold and red. The music was describing spring, full of birds and flowing water and new life. But somehow it made the autumn around him more vivid, not less. It was like the music had taught his eyes how to see properly, his ears how to hear, his heart how to feel the full weight and wonder of the present moment. A girl from his calculus class stopped him, pulling out one of his earbuds without asking, "What are you always listening to?" David hesitated. How could he explain? But then he just handed her the other earbud and kept walking. They walked together in silence, the Vivaldi playing for both of them, her expression changing from curiosity to surprise to something else, something that looked like recognition. When the movement ended, she didn't say anything, just nodded and handed back the earbud, her eyes a little wet. She understood. She'd gotten it. And David realized that this was part of it too, this sharing, this passing along of something precious. His roommate had left him a note saying, "Try track 7, and it had changed his life. Now he could do the same for someone else. The music didn't belong to him. It belonged to everyone who was willing to really listen, to open themselves up to it, to let it change them. That night, David started making his own playlist, carefully selecting pieces that had meant the most to him, putting them in an order that told a story. He titled it, "Start Here," and left it on his laptop, just in case. Just in case someone else needed a door to open, a way in. A reminder that the world was stranger and more beautiful than it seemed. And that people who'd been dead for centuries were still speaking if you knew how to listen. The emails from VE became the highlight of David's week. Every few days, a new message would arrive with recommendations, stories, and insights that transformed how he understood music. She never talked down to him, never made him feel stupid for his questions. Instead, she treated his curiosity with the same seriousness a master craftsman might show an eager apprentice. "You asked about Mahler's Fifth Symphony," one of her emails began. "Specifically, the Adagietto movement. Let me tell you something about that piece. Mahler wrote it as a love letter to his wife, Alma. He couldn't find words big enough for what he felt, so he wrote this music instead. When I was young, playing in the Vienna Philharmonic, we performed this piece maybe 50 times. And every single time, I would see people in the audience crying. Every single time." V went on to describe what it was like to sit in the violin section, feeling the music move through her body, watching the conductor shape silence and sound into something that transcended both. She talked about the technical challenges, yes, but more than that, she talked about the spiritual ones. How do you play a love letter written by someone else? How do you honor the composer's intention while also bringing your own heart to the music? "The thing people don't understand," she wrote, "is that we're not reproducing the music. We're channeling it. Every time it's played, it's reborn. Mahler has been dead for over 100 years, but every time someone plays his Adagietto, he speaks again. He loves Alma again. The grief and beauty and hope he felt becomes real again in that moment." David read that email 3 times, trying to absorb what she was saying. He'd been thinking of classical music as something preserved in amber, perfect and untouchable. But V was telling him it was alive, changing. Knew every time someone played it or listened to it with their full attention, he wrote back asking about her own life. Curious about the person behind these thoughtful messages. She was 71 now, living in Prague in the same apartment she'd grown up in. Her husband had died 5 years ago. He'd been a violist, and they'd met in music school when they were both 16. They'd spent 50 years making music together, in professional settings and just for each other, late at night, in their living room. "I miss playing with him most of all," she wrote. "Not the concerts or the applause. Just the way we could have a conversation without words through our instruments. The way he would answer something I played with a phrase of his own, and we'd both know exactly what the other meant." She told him about growing up in communist Czechoslovakia. How music had been one of the few spaces where truth could still exist. The government controlled everything else. What you could say, what you could read, where you could travel. But in a concert hall, playing Beethoven or Devoké, there was a kind of freedom that couldn't be censored. The music said things that would get you arrested if you spoke them out loud. "We played Tchaikovsky's violin concerto in Moscow once, in 1986, she remembered. The year before everything started changing. The audience was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. And then, in the second movement, this woman in the front row just started crying. Not quiet tears, sobbing, and then others joined her. By the end, half the hall was crying. Not because the music was sad, but because it was honest. It was allowing people to feel something real in a world that tried very hard to make everyone numb. David had never thought about music having that kind of power. He'd thought of it as beautiful, moving, meaningful, in a personal way. But V was describing something bigger. Music as resistance. Music as truth-telling. Music as a way to stay human when everything else was trying to turn you into something less. She started sending him pieces with stories attached. Barber's Adagio for Strings, which was played at Franklin Roosevelt's funeral and again at John Kennedy's. This piece is what grief sounds like when it's too big for words, she explained. It's been played at so many funerals, so many memorials, that it's become almost synonymous with collective mourning. But listen to it not thinking about death. Listen to it as pure sound, and you'll hear something else too. Hope. Continuation. The idea that beauty persists even in the darkest moments. Puccini's Nessun Dorma came with the translation, None Shall Sleep. It was sung by a prince who had one night to discover his beloved's name or die at dawn. It's about impossible odds in refusing to give up, V wrote. That last high B that the tenor has to hold. That's the musical equivalent of defiance. It's saying, I will win. Against everything, despite everything, I will triumph. She introduced him to pieces he'd never heard of. Gorecki's Symphony No. 3. It's written in memory of a Jewish girl in a concentration camp who'd scratched a prayer into her cell wall. Taverner's Song for Athene, which was played at Princess Diana's funeral. Vaughan Williams. The Lark Ascending, which was voted Britain's favorite piece of classical music, because it captured something essential about hope and freedom in the natural world. Every piece came with context, history, meaning. V taught David to hear not just the notes, but the human stories behind them. These weren't abstract compositions created by distant geniuses. They were people responding to love, loss, war, peace, faith, doubt, everything that makes us human. You have to understand, she wrote. These composers weren't trying to write classical music. That term didn't even exist for most of them. They were trying to write the truest thing they could, the most honest expression of whatever they were feeling or thinking or believing in that moment. The fact that it lasted, that we're still playing it and listening to it hundreds of years later, that's not because they were trying to create something timeless. It's because they were trying to create something true. David started approaching his listening differently after that. Instead of just enjoying the beauty of the music, he started asking questions. What was happening in the composer's life when they wrote this? What were they trying to say? What truth were they trying to capture? He learned that Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony when he was completely deaf. Angry, isolated, convinced the world had forgotten him. And yet he wrote this massive celebration of human brotherhood, this cry of joy and connection. How? How did someone in that much pain create something that hopeful? He discovered that Rachmaninoff wrote his Piano Concerto No. 2. After years of crippling depression following the failure of his first symphony, critics had destroyed it, and Rachmaninoff became convinced he'd never write anything good again. He went to a therapist who used hypnosis, repeating over and over, "You will write a great concerto." And he did. The second Piano Concerto was his comeback, his proof to himself and the world that he could still create beauty. That's what I love about classical music, V wrote. Every piece is a victory of some kind. A victory over silence, over death, over despair, over the limitations of the human body and mind. These composers took their joy and suffering and confusion and made it into something that could outlive them. They turned their personal experience into something universal. She told him about playing for people who'd never heard classical music before. Outreach programs in schools and hospitals and prisons. There's this moment that happens, she described, when someone really hears it for the first time. You can see it on their face. They don't know what hit them. They don't have language for what they're feeling. But something opens up inside them. Some door they didn't know was there. That's what we're really doing as musicians. We're opening doors. David thought about his own door, the one that had opened that night in his apartment when he first heard Beethoven's Ninth. He tried to imagine his life if his roommate hadn't left those headphones, if he'd never pressed play. He'd still be the same person going through the motions, surviving but not really living. Thinking the world was smaller and duller than it actually was, He started wondering if he could do that for others. Open doors. Show people what he discovered. But he wasn't a musician. He couldn't play an instrument, couldn't read music, had no formal training. What could someone like him possibly offer? "You're already doing it," V wrote back when he shared these doubts. "You're listening with your whole heart. You're letting the music change you. That matters more than you think. The world is full of musicians who can play all the notes perfectly but never touch anyone's soul. And it's full of listeners like you who understand the music more deeply than many professionals ever will." She told him about a concert she'd attended recently. A young pianist performing Chopin's nocturnes. Technically perfect, every note exactly where it should be, but cold, empty. She was playing the notes, V said, but not the music. There's a difference. The notes are just instructions. The music is what happens when you bring your humanity to those instructions. David thought about that a lot. The difference between notes and music, between technique and truth, between doing something correctly and doing something meaningfully. It applied to more than just classical music. It applied to everything. You could go through all the motions of living without actually being alive. You could hit all the right notes without making any music. That winter, V stopped responding to his emails for 2 weeks. David tried not to worry, told himself she was probably busy, traveling, enjoying her life. But he felt her absence like a physical thing. Their correspondence had become essential to him. This connection to someone who understood what he was experiencing, who could guide him deeper into this world he'd discovered. When she finally wrote back, her email was shorter than usual. She'd been in the hospital. A heart problem, nothing too serious, but it had scared her. "It made me think about time," she wrote, "about how much I have left, about what matters. I've spent my whole life with music, and I regret nothing. But I realize now that the greatest gift isn't playing. It's sharing. It's passing along what you've learned to someone who's hungry for it." She asked David what he wanted to do with his life. Really do not what he thought he should do, or what seemed practical. He'd been studying engineering because it was stable, because it led to jobs, because it made sense. But when he was honest with himself, when he listened to that voice that had been getting stronger since the night he first heard Beethoven, he knew what he really wanted. He wanted to do what V had done for him. Open doors. Help other people discover what he'd discovered. Show them that beauty and meaning and transcendence weren't abstract concepts from a better time, but real things, available right now, waiting for anyone willing to listen. David didn't know how to make that happen yet. He didn't have a plan, but he knew with the same certainty he'd felt when he first heard the Ode to Joy, that this was the direction he needed to move in. Not away from music, but toward it. Not despite its impracticality, but because of its necessity. He wrote back to V, telling her everything he'd been feeling, all his doubts and hopes and confusion. Her response came quickly this time, just 2 sentences. "Good. Now the real work begins." Changing majors felt like jumping off a cliff. David's academic advisor looked at him like he'd lost his mind. When he said he wanted to switch from engineering to music education, the advisor pulled up spreadsheets showing salary comparisons, job placement rates, return on investment. Everything pointed in one direction. "This was a terrible idea. You'll be lucky to find a job," the advisor said, not unkindly. "And when you do, you'll make half what you'd make as an engineer. You understand that, right?" David understood. But he also understood that he'd rather struggle doing something meaningful than succeed at something that left him hollow. He'd spent 19 years playing it safe, being practical, choosing the sensible path. And he'd been miserable without even realizing it until music showed him. There was another way to live. His parents were worse than the advisor. They'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, worked extra shifts, and skipped vacations so he could go to college. And now he was throwing it away to become a music teacher? They couldn't understand. The phone calls home became tense, full of long silences and disappointed sighs. "You've never even played an instrument," his mother said. "How can you teach music if you can't play?" It was a fair question. The music education program required proficiency in at least one instrument. David chose piano, the most practical option. He found a used keyboard on Craigslist for $80 and started teaching himself using YouTube videos and borrowed method books. Those first weeks were humbling. His fingers felt thick and clumsy on the keys. Simple exercises that children could play fluently seemed impossible. He'd spent months listening to the greatest pianists in history, hearing Chopin and Rachmaninoff and Liszt perform impossible feats of virtuosity. Now he was struggling to play Mary Had a Little Lamb without mistakes. But David had learned patience from listening. He'd learned that greatness wasn't instant, that every master started as a beginner, that the journey mattered as much as the destination. He practiced an hour every morning before work, his fingers gradually finding their way across the keys, muscle memory slowly forming. He started with Satie's gymnopodies, those simple, haunting pieces that moved slowly enough for his beginner's fingers to manage. They weren't technically difficult. They required something else. Feeling, touch, the ability to make silence matter as much as sound. It took David 3 months to play the first gymnopody all the way through without mistakes, and when he finally did, alone in his apartment at 2 a.m, he cried again because he'd done it. He'd taken something that existed only in his head, only in recordings, and made it real with his own hands. It wasn't perfect. His tempo wasn't quite steady, his dynamics were rough, his technique was amateurish, but it was him, his music, his offering to the composers he'd come to love, proof that what they'd created could still come alive through even the clumsiest hands. V was delighted when he told her about learning piano. "This changes everything," she wrote. "Now you'll understand from the inside. You'll know what it costs to make music, the hours of practice, the frustration, the tiny victories. Your students will feel that you understand their struggle because you're living it yourself." She started sending him practice advice. Techniques for building finger strength and coordination, ways to practice efficiently when time was limited. She reminded him to breathe while playing, to relax his shoulders, to think about the music and not just the notes. Playing an instrument is a physical activity, she explained, but it's also meditation, also prayer, also conversation. You're not just moving your fingers. You're channeling something larger than yourself. David's new classes were harder than engineering ever was, but in a different way. Music theory made his brain hurt, trying to understand harmonic progressions and chord structures and the mathematical relationships between notes. But it also made everything he'd been listening to make more sense. He could finally understand why certain chord changes hit him emotionally, why some melodies felt resolved and others felt like questions left hanging in the air. He studied music history and learned the context he'd been missing. The classical period wasn't just pretty music. It was a reaction against the complexity of the Baroque, a search for clarity and balance during the Age of Enlightenment. The Romantic period that followed was composers breaking those rules, insisting that emotion and individual expression mattered more than formal structures. The 20th century exploded in a dozen different directions as composers tried to figure out what music could be in a world that had experienced world wars and atomic bombs and mass communication. Some, like Shostakovich, worked within traditional forms, but filled them with coded messages and bitter irony. Others, like Schoenberg, threw out traditional harmony entirely, creating systems of music that challenged everything people thought they knew about. What music should sound like. David devoured all of it, his mind expanding to hold more complexity, more nuance, more history than he'd ever imagined music contained. He learned about the women composers who'd been written out of history. Fanny Mendelssohn. His brother published some of her work under his own name because women weren't taken seriously. Clara Schumann, a virtuoso pianist and composer whose husband's fame overshadowed her own considerable talent. Florence Price, an African-American composer whose symphonies were only recently being rediscovered and performed. The injustice of it made David angry. How much beauty had been lost because the world decided only certain people were allowed to create? How many masterpieces had been dismissed because the composer was the wrong gender or race or class? He started seeking out music by underrepresented composers, expanding his listening beyond the standard canon. He discovered that beauty and genius weren't limited to dead white European men. that there were brilliant composers working right now from every corner of the world, creating music that was just as moving and meaningful as anything Beethoven or Mozart ever wrote. But he also learned something else. The great composers he'd first fallen in love with were still great. Their music still mattered, still moved people, still opened doors. The solution wasn't to throw them out, but to expand the room, to make space for more voices, more perspectives, more ways of making meaning through sound. David's second year in the music education program included observation hours in actual schools. He was assigned to shadow a veteran teacher named Mr. Peterson at an underfunded high school across town. The building was falling apart, the instruments were held together with duct tape and hope, and most of the students were there because they needed an easy elective credit. Mr. Peterson was in his 50s, tired but not defeated, still showing up every day to teach kids who mostly didn't want to learn. He played them Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms, explained the historical context, pointed out themes and variations and clever musical jokes. Most students dozed off or scrolled through their phones under their desks, but David noticed one kid in the back who was actually listening. A junior named Tyler wearing a hood pulled low over his eyes, arms crossed defensively. But his foot was tapping in time with the music. His eyes were focused on the speaker, not the window. After class, David approached him. "You liked that?" Tyler shrugged, defensive. "It was all right? Which part?" "I don't know. The end part. Where it all came together. It was like..." Tyler struggled for words. "Like everything made sense, you know? All the different parts fighting each other, then suddenly they're all working together, making something bigger." David felt his heart race. This kid got it. Without any training or preparation or context, he'd heard what mattered. The music had reached him through all his defenses, all his pretended indifference. "You should listen to more," David said. "I can make you a playlist." Tyler looked skeptical but interested. "What kind of playlist?" "Stuff like what we just heard. But also newer things. Pieces that tell stories. Music that matters." David spent that evening creating a carefully curated playlist for Tyler, remembering what V had done for him. He started with accessible pieces that had clear melodies and emotional narratives. Barber's Adagio, Saint-Saëns The Swan, Dvorak's New World Symphony. But he also included some surprises. Philip Glass's minimalist repetitions, John Adams's contemporary rhythms. He made notes for each piece, short explanations about what to listen for. Tyler came back the next week with questions. Real questions. Why did the composer repeat that section? What did it mean when the mood suddenly changed? How did they know what instruments to use? David answered as best he could, drawing on everything he'd learned, everything V had taught him. Other students noticed. They wanted playlists too. Some were genuinely curious. Others just wanted the attention, but David didn't care. He made playlists for anyone who asked. He started staying after class to talk about music, to play pieces on his laptop, to watch students' faces change when something connected. Mr. Peterson pulled him aside one afternoon. "You're good at this," he said. "You make them care. That's the hardest part, and you're doing it naturally." "I just remember what it felt like," David said. "That moment when it first clicked. I want to give that to them. That's what teaching is," Mr. Peterson replied. "Giving people what someone once gave you." David thought about his old roommate, about those headphones and that note, about V's patient emails and generous guidance, about every musician who'd ever played these pieces, keeping them alive, passing them forward through time, about the composers themselves, pouring their souls onto paper in hopes that someone, someday, would hear and understand. It was all one long chain of giving. And now, David was a link in that chain, receiving and passing forward. Keeping the music alive by sharing it, his girlfriend, someone he'd met in his music history class, told him she loved watching him talk about music. "Your whole face changes," she said. "You light up. It's like you're in love." She wasn't wrong. David was in love. With beauty, with meaning, with the possibility of connection across time and death and difference, with the idea that humans could create something that outlasted their individual lives, something that could touch people centuries later, something that proved we were more than just biology and survival instinct. His grandmother died that spring, and David was asked to choose music for her funeral. He thought about what would honor her, what would help the family grieve, what would acknowledge both the sadness of loss and the celebration of a life fully lived. He chose for S Requiem, specifically the Imperatism movement at the service. As the choir sang for his soaring melodies about angels carrying his grandmother to paradise, David watched his family. His mother, who'd been so disappointed in his career change, was crying. His father, who'd thought classical music was pointless and impractical, had his eyes closed, absorbed in the moment. His cousins, who'd never heard anything like this, were still reverent, touched by something they couldn't name. After the service, his mother hugged him. "That was beautiful," she said. "I didn't know music could do that. Make it hurt less and mean more at the same time." David thought about trying to explain, about telling her everything he'd learned about music's power to carry what words couldn't hold. But he didn't need to. She'd felt it. That was enough. That night, he wrote to V telling her about the funeral, about his mother's reaction, about the way music had helped his family through grief. Her response was brief but meaningful. "You've become what you needed. Now go help others do the same." 5 years later, David stood in front of his own classroom for the first time as a real teacher, not a student observer. The school was in one of the poorest districts in the state, the kind of place where most teachers burned out within 2 years. The music room had water stains on the ceiling, ancient instruments that barely stayed in tune, and a sound system that crackled with static. It was perfect, the first day. 32 students filed in with that particular brand of teenage skepticism he remembered from his observation hours. Most of them were there because they needed an arts credit to graduate. Some were actively hostile, seeing music class as a waste of time, something for soft kids who couldn't handle real subjects. A few looked quietly interested but trying to hide it, not wanting to seem uncool. David didn't start with a speech about the importance of music or the beauty of classical composers. Instead, he just said, "Close your eyes. Just trust me for 3 minutes." He played them Barber's Adagio for strings. The piece V had told him about years ago. The one that was played at funerals and memorials because it captured grief too big for words. He watched their faces as the music built, as the strings climbed higher and higher, as the emotion swelled until it seemed like it might break. When it ended, the silence in the room was different than before, heavier, more real. A girl in the 3rd row had tears on her cheeks. A boy in the back who'd been slouching was sitting up straight, his defenses temporarily forgotten. Another student, a tough-looking kid named Luis, who had a reputation for being trouble, was staring at the speaker like it had personally attacked him. "What was that?" Luis asked, his voice rougher than usual. David said, "Was Samuel Barber. He wrote it in 1936. It's been played at President Kennedy's funeral, at President Roosevelt's memorial, at the 9/11's remembrance ceremonies. People play it when they need music that understands what they're feeling." "Play it again," someone said. David did. And this time, he told them what to listen for. The way the melody climbed, the way the harmonies created tension, the way silence mattered as much as sound, the way the music asked a question with no answer, expressed pain that couldn't be fixed, acknowledged that sometimes life was just hard and the only response was to feel it fully. By the end of that first week, David knew which students were going to be his Tylers, the ones who actually wanted to be there. But he also knew that every single student had that capacity inside them, that door waiting to be opened. His job wasn't to force it. His job was to keep offering the key until they were ready to use it. He taught them the standard curriculum, music theory and history they needed to know for tests and credits. But he also taught them why it mattered. He played them Beethoven's Ninth, told them about a deaf man who wrote Celebration when he had every reason to write Bitterness. He played them Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony and explained about living under Stalin, about coding messages into music, about using art as resistance. He introduced them to Mahler's massive symphonies and explained that Mahler had said a symphony should be like the world, containing everything. Joy and grief, hope and despair, the profound and the silly, all mixed together because that's what life actually is. He played them Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and told them about the riot at its premiere, about audiences who couldn't handle music that raw and primal and honest. But he also played them contemporary composers. Caroline Shaw and Nico Muhly and Missy Mazzoli. He showed them that classical music wasn't dead, wasn't just something from history books. It was alive, evolving, being created right now by people who understood the tradition but weren't trapped by it. The real breakthrough came in December, 3 months into the school year. Luis, the tough kid from that first day, had been coming to class regularly, but remaining mostly quiet, listening but not participating. Then one day, he stayed after class. "Can I ask you something?" Luis said, looking uncomfortable. "How do you make something like that?" "Like that sad string piece from the first day." David pulled up a chair. "You want to write music?"